So again, this study that we did for climate change, or for Southern California, it was the first piece, I guess, of looking at how do we plan this infrastructure? How do we create resilient infrastructure? How do we get past this desire to extrapolate past trends? Because that's really, I think it's doing a big disservice to us. So what we did is we started looking at, can we actually do some modeling, put some numbers towards some of these things rather than talking about vagaries. So this is the depletion model we've been using since 2005, saying this is how much oil is available to us in North America for fuel. This is a depletion scenario. Basically flat to 2010, a 2% decline to 2015, and then a 4% decline beyond that. And that's basically available conventional oil available to us as consumers in North America. I'd love to talk about where that comes from, but maybe at the end we can talk about that. So in this case, we're looking at truck travel because, again, trucks are a much harder problem than the personal mobility. Personal mobility is a relatively easy problem compared to the goods movement. So if this is how many trucks we have driving around today using oil, that's how many trucks we have driving around, how many miles using oil in the future. Now, of course, there are many things that we're going to be doing in response to this decline in oil. So we're going to have non-conventional oil from the tar sands and other types of things like ethanol. We're going to have some biofuels which are better than ethanol. We're going to have vehicle efficiency. The trucks will be able to become more efficient. And then finally, we'll actually have electrification where we're able to move some of that fleet off of these liquid fuels. And we model each of those as a wedge, because it's not enough to just say, oh, electrification is going to save the day. We've got to look at how quickly that can scale up, how quickly we can change out the fleet, and then make some assumptions about, okay, is there enough of an economy going to actually scale up that technology? Now, the interesting thing when you start running these scenarios is you start to see some things that are very different than business as usual. This is the road capacity that's actually required for moving those trucks on the road, given the amount of fuel that we have available. And it looks like for at least probably the next 40 years or so, we are today at what could be called peak roads. This is an idea that we have as much road capacity today as we will ever need or ever be able to use. And this is fundamentally different than the way we've thought about growing our cities throughout the last 100 years. And going forward, this idea of this kind of limits or saying, okay, we have enough, is very different than this sort of growth as usual model, which leads to investment in more and more and more infrastructure. So when we look at that gap then, what's left over between all of our strategies and then business as usual? That gap in the middle, that's the local. This is the stuff, instead of the apple coming from New Zealand, this is the apple coming from down the road. So as soon as you can relocalize aspects of your economy, that's stuff that's not having to be transported. So when we start to do this modeling, we start to see, okay, we can see the scale that our local economy is going to have to grow to provide these things that we're currently getting on the global economy. And so I look at 2025, 2030, about peak local, you might call it. Because there's this real delay between when we see the motivation for change and then how quickly we are able to actually scale up those solutions. So back to that camel bus idea, there's going to be a need to take what we have and sort of repurpose it and make do with it in very kind of creative ways that isn't about just substituting in some sort of new high technology. So when we come back and we say, okay, peak roads, if that's the case, then any incremental highway expansion, but we're beyond where we are today, is very likely going to be a stranded asset. And when I look at scenarios, it's not about saying, okay, I know the future, I know about exactly what's going to happen with climate or peak oil and climate change, but I can put the scenarios up there, and I can say this investment here, whether it's in transit or land use or whatever, is a more resilient investment because it pays us back in any one of those futures. The investment in roads only pays us back in a future that looks like the past. So when we come to talk about it, I think it's critical that we don't speak about it in absolutist terms, but we can say, okay, we've looked at the numbers, we've crunched it, we've looked at a bunch of different scenarios, and this is the wise investment to have going forward. So then the last piece is, okay, how do we actually take these ideas and bring them to scale in our cities? Because, we sit around and talk with the 10% of us who like to talk about these things, while the other 90% of people kind of go about their regular business. So I think this is a chart I've been looking at and using, because I think it really shows a lot about how it is that we're actually going to be transitioning to a low-carbon future. People have talked about this. This is vehicle miles traveled on U.S. roads, starting back after the last oil crisis, 1984, growing continuously. Now, this is all the debate about climate change, smart growth, recycling, changing your light bulbs, buy a Prius, please ride the bus. Really didn't do anything. All that time. We got up to here, $60 oil, $100 oil, $150 oil, and then a major recession. That's what changed behavior. That's what brought about change at scale. So we look at price spikes and recession, and if we rewind again back to the 70s, what we had was, again, shortages and rationing. Sort of maybe to retouch on what Richard Gilbert was saying about rationing, I believe that these are the mechanisms going forward that are going to bring about change at scale. So I've stopped trying to say, pretty please get out of your SUV and ride the transit. And I've tried to say, okay, those of us who are looking at these things, can we put in place the ideas and capacity today such that when the motivation is there from one of these four things, the public in general has the ability to pick up good ideas and move it up at scale. So I think we see what we have are these two kind of regimes where we have incremental change, climate policy, smart growth, all this stuff that's frustrating and takes a long time and doesn't feel like we're going fast enough. But when we start to think about it, this is actually critical because these are the things that we draw on when we move into that period of shock response. So when we start having to deal with things like price spikes and rationing and whatnot, these are the ideas and tools that we draw upon. So when we're looking at planning our cities, we can create the pilot projects, we can set the targets, we can make more resilient infrastructure investments, and then we have to have a plan to scale that up rapidly. We can have a few people with community gardens, but then we need a plan. How do we scale up local food production quickly when we need to? I think there's been a lot of people who have looked at Cuba as an example of this kind of rapid transformation in regard to how they reacted to losing their oil supply. And I think we need to start thinking about our resiliency approach as being integrated with sustainability in this way. So what we're doing is during this incremental period, we're building capacity for positive change, and then we're using it. And so I think this is it's a critical idea that I don't think we're going to have the massive march on Washington that's going to demand a local economy. I don't think we're going to convince people to get out of their cars because of climate change. Frankly, I can't think of a climate catastrophe bad enough to bring about the level of change that's actually needed in terms of looking at just climate change. I would love to say that our Western democracy had the capacity to do that, but I think that the real change is going to be a shock response model along the lines of those things: price spikes, recession, and rationing. There was a peak oil conference a couple years back, and this guy stood up, very wealthy guy. He says, I was talking to my wife the other day about buying a Prius, and she says, well, why should we buy a Prius? We can afford $4 a gallon gas. And he says, well, when they bring about rationing, we're going to go 4 times as far in our Prius as we do in our Cadillac. The way we make decisions under those situations is very different than the way we make decisions under this kind of incremental change. And so I think what we can start to look at is that many of the things that we talk about in terms of sustainability today are going to be things that are necessary for people to kind of get by on a daily basis. And I think, in Vancouver, we have this interesting sort of local food, culture, but they're looking to Detroit and saying, okay, here's a city where its mainstream economy collapsed, people have left, and you have the kind of fallow ground. And into this sort of space, there's this kind of nascent sort of localism that's forming and growing out of the kind of what's left there. And there's, I haven't been there, I'd love to see it, but there's a real fascination with how do we create these systems that people can use not just when it's needed for environmentalism, but when you need it to actually cope with the fact that you've lost a job or energies or food has become more expensive. So finally, the question then is, okay, well, what do we do about it? I'm an architect and I work as a planner. So it's one thing to start with the vision. At some point, you've got to kind of figure out how does that translate into nuts and bolts. This is the city of Vancouver recently announced a new program. They're calling it the World's Greenest City Initiative. And the aim is to try to be the world's greenest city by 2020. And so they have these very kind of high order goals. A lot of good, really, good ideas. But they're solidly within this idea of kind of technology and sustainability and smart growth. So what we're doing is looking at trying to layer over that a resilient Vancouver task force to look at some of these other issues around what is a reference scenario for combining peak oil and climate change impacts. When we look at this, how fast does oil go away? We need to put some numbers to it. What are the impacts of sea level rise? How many climate migrants are we going to have to absorb as a city going forward? Where's the economy going to be, and how is that going to affect our ability to build levees or build wind turbines or whatever else? So making a whole set of assumptions, and this isn't to say, oh, we're focusing on doom and gloom, but it's saying we have, in one hand, this positive, glorious vision of the green future, and then we have this sort of pragmatic focus on what are the real kind of shocks in the road that are going to bring about change and how we should deal with that. The other thing we're needing to do is look at our current policy, our climate policy, and saying, are we actually addressing oil dependence, or are we leaving ourselves completely vulnerable to the impacts of peak oil? So I think there's a need to kind of filter, prioritize, rejig our current climate policy. Then next, looking at sort of stress tests, this idea, where within our society, our food system, who are our most vulnerable populations? What are our most vulnerable businesses? Can they cope with rising prices? Can they cope with shortage? Can they cope with recession or even rationing? And so then when we start looking at building a more sustainable economy, can we prioritize those systems that don't just make us green, but also make us more resilient, make our food system more resilient, our housing system more resilient? And then finally, this idea of capacity building, this idea of doing pilot projects, of taking these kind of the seeds of radical transformation, which exist within everybody in this room, and planting those throughout the city such that they can flourish when the conventional systems break down. So we're really trying to wrestle with that one a little bit, looking at like the transition networks and the transition movement, these kind of grassroots organizations, looking at the local economy and local money groups. Can we put enough of these things in place throughout the city, have enough people who know how they work, have enough tools, enough shovels on the ground, enough land planned ahead of time, that those ideas can scale up once the conventional economy goes through this cycle of breakdown and renewal. So that's what we're trying to figure out, is bringing the sort of top-down together with the grassroots, bringing this kind of idea of a positive vision together with a very pragmatic idea of what are the real stresses that we're going to be facing as a community. And I think that our ability to sort of hold those simultaneously together is what's going to really allow us to kind of prosper through that transition. And so with that, I'm going to leave it there. Like I said, we work in the city of Vancouver with planners, trying to work with cities and organizations to bring these ideas into our mainstream planning. But we'd be happy to talk about anyone else here who's dealing with the same issues within their local city, so we can try and bring these ideas and diffuse them out. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to talking with you later.